Hello, I'm Arjuna Herbst, and this is my final project for CPSC326, Organization of Programming Languages here at Gonzaga. What I did for this project was I added HTML support to MyPL, which is the language we've been working with and building from the ground up this whole semester. So just to get it going, I figured the best way to demonstrate my add-ons would just be to run some scripts, kind of just show you what is now allowed in MyPL with some example programs. So the first one we have here is just a pretty simple, we're setting a variable and then we're printing it, but you also see right here that we're concatenating the values as well. We're just printing page twice. That's another feature I'll get into later in the video, but HTML concatenation and HTML to string concatenation is allowed now in MyPL as well. But basically in this script, you'll see we're setting the variable page equal to this nice string of HTML right here. You'll see the start and end tokens are just a greater than, less than with the question mark. But if we hop over to the output from this file, you'll see right here that the program basically prints out page. And you'll also see that it pretty prints, which is another feature that I'll get into later in the video. But let's jump over to a different MyPL program right now. You'll see in this program, we are setting an array of size 2, and then we're setting the first index in the array to div1, and then we're setting the second index in the array to div2, and we're just printing both of them. So if we go to the output from this program, you'll see that both divs are printed and they're both populated with the correct text. So MyPL now supports adding HTML values into an array as well. And then for the last demo script here, we have a function that takes in HTML and then it appends that HTML value that it got as a parameter to some static HTML tags right here. And then down in our main, we're just printing that out. We're setting this span as well to be inserted into this div. So if we go to the output for this, you'll see right here that the function successfully took the parameter and then appended it to that static HTML and then returned it. And then the result is pretty printed to the terminal. And so a little bit more about that pretty print, since you see it quite prominently there in the terminal. How this is working is basically, to start this project, I created a HTML value class, which basically just encapsulates all HTML content when one is created. And then this class is used whenever an HTML value is created, manipulated, or printed. And so in this class, it also has a pretty print method, which is what's called, rather than just a simple toString method. Pretty print displays the HTML content in a nice way in the terminal, so it's easier to read and it is easier to move into actual HTML file if need be. And then another feature that I was talking about a bit in those demo scripts, which you saw, is concatenation. And this works by some changes to the VM and semantic checker. So firstly, the VM already has a method in place called add helper, which basically just adds objects together and it checks if certain types are allowed to be added together as well. And so first we had to change that add helper method to support string plus HTML, HTML plus string, and then HTML plus HTML. And then from there, modifications of the semantic checker too. Just had to allow for object adding logic. So again, just allowing two HTML values to be added together or a string plus an HTML or vice versa. And so overall though, this project involved changes to both the parser and the lexer, semantic checker, code generation, and the VM, which I'll get into right here. So for the parser and lexer, first, obviously you have to add the HTML start and end tags or tokens. And then You saw those in the demo scripts previously, and then HTML val is just the token for anything contained inside of those tags, which will then be passed to the preprint method. And then as for type, the parser has to allow HTML as a variable type. Obviously, if you're able to assign it to a variable, the parser has to be able to recognize that. And then it also has to be allowed as a function parameter and a return type. So that's how those functions were working earlier in the first script where you're passing HTML content to be appended to static HTML. It's both returning and taking HTML as a parameter. Um, and then HTML values in the lecture have to be allowed as valid R values in assignments as well. So that has to not throw an error. Um, and then as for the semantic checker, basically semantic checker, the type system had to be changed to um, allow HTML values to be one of the base types within MyPL in the first place. And then from there, you have to change function signatures to allow functions to return and accept HTML types. Um, so overall, the semantic checker and then the parser and lexer changes were not that complicated. It's more when we got to the VM and code generation when problems started happening because I realized pretty print should probably be a thing, and that took a bit of time to figure out. Um, so for code gen, um, you have to create a whole separate opcode for HTML value handling. So you have to be able to push these like custom values onto the stack without breaking it. Um, and so from there too, for since concatenation was implemented, also have to check for binary plus expressions, which involve HTML, and then you have to generate the add instruction in the correct place for those sort of concatenation operations. Um, and then in the VM, again, like mentioned earlier, the add helper and then HTML value class modifications, these have to be thrown the add value when needed. And then I had to change the write method as well inside the VM because without pointing towards the pretty print method in the HTML value class, it would just be printing HTML as a string, which is just one line and doesn't look that good. And then type safety. So have to ensure that invalid operations, so stuff like HTML plus int or like HTML divided by float, throw errors in the correct place, MyPL errors specifically. And then speaking of throwing errors, some testing approaches for this project. Um, for the lecture, mostly just wrote tests to check that the correct token types were being recognized. And then obviously handling of white spaces and special characters within. HTML was also properly handled. White space is already being handled before, but special characters had to do some modifications for that. And then things like unterminated tags or missing spaces within HTML values were checked for within my test cases. And then for the parser, um, had to make sure that it could understand that you're able to have HTML, and you can assign variables to HTML values. Um, again, have to ensure that HTML literals are treated as R values, and then again, making sure that HTML can't go through illegal math operations, which would probably break my PL. Um, sorry, I missed this slide. Um, and then for semantic checker, um, had to ensure that type checking for HTML values was making sure that it was a valid variable type and then parameter return type. And then also had to ensure that HTML can't be assigned to a string and vice versa. Um, and then for VM and CodeGen, I wrote some tests to make sure that the HTML was pretty printing correctly and it was printing all the content of the HTML, made sure it wasn't missing any values inside the tags. And then also had to ensure that it could be passed and then printed from a function as well. And then making sure that HTML, again, once again, can't be divided by a number. Um, so all these tests combined, there are more in my code, which you can see on GitHub, but these are kind of the important ones for this project. And overall, adding the HTML value to this project taught me a lot about my PL. Taught me a lot about how the structure of it works and how the parts kind of communicate with one another. So it was a good project. And that's all I have. So thank you.